Hello and welcome. My name is Cameron Vanloo. I'm one of the senior lecturers here at the University of Staffordshire in Esports, and today I'm joined by...
Hello, I'm Jamie Nicholas. I am one of the lecturers in the Games Development Department. I am a lecturer in VFX and Games Technical Design. I'm not a senior lecturer. That falls down to you. What are we doing today, Cameron?
Today we're going to be looking at cognitive overload, which occurs in terms of the human brain and psychology. And welcome to developer mode.
Awesome.
So I thought today we would have a pretty chilled and random sort of chat about cognitive overload, right? So usually when we talk about on development, we're usually looking at games in relation to programming, design, etc. But as I'm in relation to the esports department and as your solo esports representative in developer mode at this stage,
we let one of you in.
Yeah, you do let one of us in. I don't know what occasion, but I thought it was important that we looked at sort of the end product of games, right? So we looked at it in terms of the user experience at the end point. And I thought having you with me in relation to being VFX and all the shiny stuff, as we like to call it.
All the shiny, pretty things, yes.
I thought it would be good to look at how those impacts influence the behavior of gamers and how it sort of interferes. Maybe the right word or maybe the wrong word. We'll look at that a little bit in terms of today in relation to the overall performance within game. So one of the things I want us to look at to start off with is understanding cognitive architecture, right? And cognitive architecture is something that has been ongoing within neuroscience for a long period of time. It's about looking at our short and long-term memory. And we've looked at this in terms of a range of different aspects, both within education, within development, and even within games in more recent years in relation to things such as game studies, and in terms of performance and psychology within traditional sports. So bringing those two areas together, game design, performance and sport, we can sort of start looking at how it impacts in terms of esports and maybe in relation to the actual gaming UI itself.
So you should know, because you said neuroscience, I'm now imagining you as Derek Shepherd from Grey's Anatomy, but holding like an N64 controller.
I like that.
That's the vibe I'm getting from you right now.
Yeah, that's the look that I was hoping you get out of it. Just imagine me with potentially some hair as well, and that maybe feel a little bit better. So one of the things that we want to look at is our working memory. And our working memory is what we use to be able to communicate, be able to identify, and if you look in this environment, we're using our working memory to be able to have this discussion, bring up some key points, etc. Our working memory has taken, I don't know, a bit of a short-term fuse in terms of what we're paying attention to. But as an overview, we can break it down into two sort of areas of thought. The first one is a 7+2 chunk model, right? And this model was seen as scientific evidence improved from about 1980 to about 2012 is the main sort of viewpoint on it, but we would be able to process 7+2 chunks of data at any one time. However, in terms of modern sort of science, in terms of delivery, is realistic. We can only process 4 chunks of data at any one point, which means that we're actually maybe not as smart as we thought we were.
What are those 4 chunks of data? What can they be?
So those 4 chunks of data are anything that we can take as visual stimuli within that moment. So if we look at our lovely studio around us here, we can take in about 4 different variables of data at any one time. So I could take in terms of the light, the lovely screen behind me, our lovely production team over there, and probably you. If I was trying to do anything else, I would start to struggle, right?
I've just done the same and seen a Google Chrome logo in the top right corner of the magical screen behind you, which has broken the magic for me.
Oh,
go on.
That's okay. Well, could be worse. It could be Internet Explorer.
Other browsers are available.
Yeah, Opera GX, there's a load of them. So we can think about this in terms of what we can realistically look at. So when we look at this in a game situation, especially when we're playing a PvP game, so a player versus player game, we are constantly bombarded by information. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just there to look pretty, as we've talked about a little bit.
Looked at me when he said that.
I did indeed. And we can start thinking about how much information can a player take in at any one time. I originally started looking at this in relation to a lovely game that Jamie and me were talking about beforehand, League of Legends. And we were looking at the information that a person could take on within this environment. So where I looked in terms of it was, we were looking at in terms of spatial temporal information. So what we can see and what we can do. I like to call this monkey see, monkey do, right? The idea is I can see what's going in front of me. I'm going to act in terms of that. As a tank player within games, monkey see, monkey do is literally all I do. I run straight at people with my tank, and I hope that I survive and someone follows me. Doesn't usually happen. That's what is our first instinctive response, right? And when we're in a high pressure or developmental situation, we can see that we are going to have those instinctive reactions, right? If I decided to go for a slap on Jamie in this situation, I'm assuming that you're going to dodge out the way, or you are likely to hit.
So
You would hope so.
I'd have some sort of reaction to it.
So this is what we call as our temporal information, right? It's our instinctive natural reaction. The next thing that we can look at in relation to this is the information that the game's designers want us to know, right? So this could include a few different informations that will help us to make constructive decisions using our frontal lobar cortex. So these are stuff like enemy cooldowns. And we're going to talk about a few of the VFX aspects in relation to these bits, so we can have a little bit. So we're going to have enemy cooldowns, map awareness and map sizing, and also in relation to kill and death timers. So I want us to realistically talk about how the game design in relation to this, in terms of VFX, make the players aware of players missing within the game, either through being dead, or from disconnecting, or from using a major ability. So how would you, as a VFX artist, implement these situations, both within games so the player's aware, and to also try to take some strain away from that cognitive load?
Okay, so yeah, I can talk about that. I'm hyper aware of the fact that you've just used words like cortex, so I'm going to need to sound equally as smart without being allowed to use the word cortex, as I don't deal with that. Let's talk about VFX first.
Yeah, let's talk about VFX.
VFX is all about communication, specifically of gameplay information. But to do that effectively, one of the things that we have to bear in mind is the other bits of information that players are reading into, and also the environment they're playing it in, and the information that is important at that moment to what's going on in gameplay. So one of the key things we do with visual effects is we will vary something referred to as value, which can be in layman's terms referred to as something like how bright something is. And we can vary value within VFX as well as the rest of the elements on screen to adjust which ones we noticed first.
Yep.
So imagine a set of different ranges. For a game like League of Legends, the thing that we as the player needs to know about, very key, is information about our own character.
Yes.
And a lot of that is displayed via UI, correct?
Yep, it's very much in our UI.
Yeah, so for that, what we do is we specifically chunk out the top range of those values. So the highest value colors, the highest values of possible colors to the top of the range. So really, really bright. So that those are the things that we see first.
Yes.
So we see the brightest thing first. I'm looking at a camera in front of me. The camera is a matte black color, but the thing I'm noticing first every time I look over is the red recording light on it, because that is a higher value than the camera itself. So we notice that first.
Yeah.
And then there's ranges underneath that. So there's the character range, so that it's sort of a more middle ground kind of range, because we need to see where those characters are, but they need to be varied as well. They can't all be bright colors. There's also the environment range, which is generally usually a little bit lower, because we need to see the characters and their values popping on top of a darker background.
Yep.
So we've established all these different ranges. So we've got the environment, which is kind of lower, characters, which are kind of in the middle, and UI, which is kind of at the top. So you've got all these different ranges. The problem with that is you have a highly varied game environment. So you've got lots of different colors going on. You've got lots of different things you can see. VFX, the stuff that conveys gameplay information to the player, so the active stuff going on in the world, the stuff that you need to pick up on to make tactical decisions. The thing we do with that to make sure that you can read it across the entire game value spectrum is we actually use a good chunk of the entire spectrum, not the highest ones, because you still need those UIs to be the main ones, but a good chunk of the rest of the spectrum. So dark colors, light colors. We blend them together into effects so that you can see them in both light environments and dark environments on top of lighter characters and darker character aspects, as well as anywhere in the game that has a varied color space.
Yeah.
So if you look at a lot of the effects in MOBA games or in League of Legends, you'll see that a lot of them have darker color, like sort of shadowed backgrounds or misty backgrounds, with a very sort of lighter colored projectile or object on top, which is the indicative element of that effect. And by doing that, you can read the effects, which is the gameplay functionality, across the entire game.
Yeah.
So that's just like one little artistic aspect that we use. There's a whole bunch of different ones that we add in, but it's something we do to make sure that the gameplay purposes of the things that we've created translate to the player.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good explanation. And as Jamie instinctively asked me to do beforehand, to mention these are sick quips. So
they were going to be like funny little sick quips, and then you started talking about science. And I'm like, oh no, I can't look like the like baby boffin in the corner who's particularly know what he's on about.
That's absolutely fine. You explained that really well, and now I'm going to have to try to expand on it. And it's going to be a bit of a competition here. This was meant to be accessible to all, Jamie, and now we're going down this rabbit hole.
You know that meme of the two brains that are like converging? That's where we are. Sorry, folks.
So I'm going to try to bring it back down a little bit to earth now, because I feel like we've probably got a little bit too deep, a little bit too quickly. So I want us to think about this in terms of the real game environment, right? So I want us to think about this in terms of why do we think overload actually occurs, and is overload something that is a game design issue or is it a human science issue, right? And I think it's a mixture of both. And I think we could both look at it from a point of view of a lot of the games that we're going to discuss today are games as a service game, right? And I think these are the games that realistically impact cognitive overload the most. Because these games are what I like to call living service games. So that means they are living and they are constantly developing and changing. And I think that's a whole new struggle for game designers as a construct. And I think because of the fact that multiple different people are working on this game at different styles of it, it probably creates sometimes forgetful overloads. And I think forgetful overload is a pretty interesting term here where, for example, I could be working in terms of player output in relation to my team, and Jamie could be working in the VFX department in another part of the world, as examples. And we don't always see or communicate eye to eye. We may be having different patches that we're currently working on, and we don't realize that these overloads sort of take place. And I don't think it's just in relation to the players. I don't think it's just in relation to the game design. I think it's a mixture of both, realistically. So when I think about this in terms of real world situations, and what we can sort of take is some of these in situations need to be seen as multidimensional. So these aren't just players, these aren't just game design, these are not just in relation to the games themselves, but it could be in relation to a whole range of factors. And when I was doing this research into it, I wanted to look at it from a what's the word? Historical? Maybe historical was the right word. Holistic was the word I was trying to get out. So yeah,
okay.
So holistic point of view. So looking at the player and the environment within that. So there are a few things that can cause cognitive overload, which are neither of our particular areas of like knowledge, but this is in relation to stuff like ping and latency, right? So we look at this in relation to slow processes. We can also look at this in terms of precision, in terms of mechanical executions as well, which is another aspect that go into it. Players are a range of different skill levels. That's the joys of competitive games or like games as a service. Players get better as the game as they learn about the game, unless you're me and then you're just hard stuck in silver in League of Legends for 15 years.
But you're ranked, which is more than I have ever got in a competitive game ever.
Yeah, let's go with that. I think you can get silver. I think anyone can get silver as long as they've got two hands. And so even players without two hands are probably better than me.
2 hands, no time.
No time. Let's go with no time. But these are certain things we can go with. And we were also looking at it in terms of lack of clarity in terms of game mechanics as well. So take League of Legends as the example, because we've been using it for this. And it's a game that I think both of us probably know the best that has these mechanics. Jamie's not very convinced about that.
I know it from a technical design and visual effects perspective. Playing it is another matter. You can know a lot about football and not be able to kick one for the life of you.
That is me. I know a lot about football, but don't know how to kick a ball very well. Anyway, so we were looking at this in relation to a few different characters. In League of Legends is obviously a 15-plus-year-old game at this point, and they've got 116-plus characters, and those UIs are going to look similar, right? And some of the lack of clarity in terms of game mechanics can be quite difficult, especially the W. So if you look at it in relation to League of Legends, they have 4 abilities per character: Q, W, E, and R. They're just the random buttons which are allocated to it just because of the positioning. Usually the second ability, which most players will know as a W, can look quite similar from character to character. So if you take someone like Talia and Malphite, they're both very brown, earth-based characters. Their Ws look very similar in terms of the UI. The great thing about that is Talia's a mage and Malphite's a tank. I would love to have an image showing this, but unfortunately I do not today. You just have to
interpret the things you're saying.
Yeah, we can do that. So
part of my job.
yeah, so even with these two little things in terms of it can make it more difficult from a user experience point of view. And these are some of the issues that we see in terms of the complex nature of live service games as well, where if players aren't coming to the game when those games are getting developed and constantly learning, it becomes very, very difficult and then becomes a cognitive overload when players have to want to return to a game, right? So, and we see this quite often within different games. I think if we looked at Fortnite or we looked at Overwatch or anything of a live service game, realistically, if you take a hiatus or a break from that game, it's really hard for you to come back, right? Because there's new patches, new changes, new metas, new heroes or agents or whatever you want to call them in terms of it. And that produces another level of strain, right? So it's important that we understand as developers, or in my case, someone who just talks to developers, because trying to get me to make anything is going to be very fun.
No, I'll get you there.
You'll get me there. We have to understand the fact that these behaviors are to try to keep hardcore players involved and to make them want to develop and spend time in games. But I want to use the word shun lightly. I know shun's not a very nice word, but I want us to use it quite lightly in this. You shun players who aren't able to dedicate those times to it. And I think that's quite important for us to understand, is the fact that when players take a hiatus from a game, that cognitive system does become quite difficult. I'm going to ask you a follow-up now in relation to this, and I want you to talk about, from a game design perspective, how do you encourage players to come back?
See, this is a difficult one.
Yeah.
It may verge into a VFX answer if that's okay.
That's absolutely okay.
Really good at.
Okay, I'll go with that.
The thing that I would point to would be familiarity. People like coming back to systems that are understood. They don't have to particularly learn them again. Games have shared systems across different, let's say platforms, but different platforms, different iterations, different titles. And there's shared concepts between them as to how things are done.
Yep.
And there's also things like motifs of certain genres. And there's also sort of shared overlapping concepts that we understand at base level. So like from a gameplay perspective, if we are somebody who wanted to jump into Valorant or make a game similar to Valorant, or let's say like CSGO, like a kind of hero shooter style game, CS, less hero shooter, but that kind of style of game, 5v5, that kind of sort of environment. a lot of the things we would do to make that game would not necessarily be stealing from those games, but replicating how those systems work to create the core of that genre. So I go into CSGO, I know what I'm doing in the buy menu, I know what guns are there, I know where I've put them, I know how the sort of finance system works.
Familiarity, right?
Familiarity. Same as if I went into Valorant, that buy system is the same. The economy system, similar, a little bit different, but it's still working the same. I'm still, fighting around, shooting people, getting money, get better guns to shoot people. That gameplay loop remains the same across the genre.
So I'm going to ask you another question in relation to that, because this was something I didn't even think about. Does this make it hard to develop new genres of games because of the fact that players do need that familiarity in terms of psychological bouncing back and forth?
I would say it doesn't.
Okay.
In the same way that we as a society have invented F1 racing, rallycross, the one that's like a race that lasts like 48 hours.
Oh, that's 24 hours Le Mans, I think.
Yeah, Le Mans.
Yeah.
Every time that they make I'm amazed that I came up with a car reference. So
I'm shocked. Do you know what I'm really annoyed by though?
But
you forgot one very important style of racing.
Which one?
Lawnmower racing.
Lawnmower racing. The thing is, across all of these, very different sports, very different variables, they've not reinvented the car every time they've done it. They're different variations of the same invention. And the same can be said for game genres.
Yep.
You vary the different variables inside of the game, the different design aspects, to create different gameplay experiences. So in CSGO, which is a game I never thought I'd talk about professionally because I haven't played it until a year ago. In CSGO, you are putting yourself in the shoes of like a counter-terrorist squad, and you're using sort of vaguely realistic kind of tactical approaches. So covering corners, covering approaches, doing covering fire, using tactical grenades. Colleague Brad would be incredibly impressed that I'm actually talking about this in a cognitive way because my description of it does not match my gameplay. But if you jump,
so don't worry.
but if you jump from CSGO into Valorant, same base, you've got a gun, you've got a buy menu, you're running around with a team of 5, you're placing down a bomb. Spike. In that variation, you have hero powers, which vary how the gameplay plays. You're not playing as a perfect military force. You're playing as some sort of mystical, dimensional, weird, I've not looked at the lore, but you're a sort of agent, space agent fighter thing. It's a different approach to the same concept. And one of the things that we can actually keep similar between them and to possibly reduce this idea of cognitive load is the kind of language we use between the two games, or the two, imagine any two games in any one genre. We can share information between them using things like color language and semiotic theory. And that's stuff like green being the color of health, and the idea of different shapes having different meanings. So let's say you're playing a game of Valorant, if a sharp-looking projectile is coming your way, you're going to get damaged. And that's the same inside of CSGO. Bullets tend to be sharper shapes. You know that you're in a level of danger because the shape language is translating over. That's something we can use in all games as well. And what it does is it reaches past sort of our conscious cognitive ability and into our sort of base understanding on an instinctive level what these different things mean. Color's a bit of a different one because color information can mean different things in different parts of the world, and we read colors differently, the same as things like symbols and semiotics. Shape is a bit of an easier one because we know if we see something sharp or a sharp shape like a knife or a spike, we know that is dangerous because that is a universal experience. And we can apply that to lots of different shapes as well. So we have that kind of instinct that we can draw into.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good point to add on to from this in relation to Valorant and CS in particular, we create this overload, right? So it's actually purpose in terms of game design that these rounds are very short, they are very direct, and they are purposely built to create some level of overload. Especially when we look at this in terms of, we look at this in terms of cognitive systems, and we also look at this in terms of rapid sort of updated responses, both in terms of visual effects, and we've highlighted that in terms of trying to make sure that the player knows exactly what is likely to impact them. We also look at this in terms of precision of utility, usage, and tactical communication, right? So we are looking at rapid responses, both from the player, but also in relation to the visual stimuli that helps them to navigate those environments. Some of the time we use VFX, especially in these situations, to try to disturb the player from being able to complete the task. These are stuff like walls, etc. And these walls are there to be quite obvious, especially within stuff like Valorant, or when we look at CS as examples, where we've got smoke or mollies in relation to it. We end up seeing these are purposely made that the player cannot see around them or see through them. And it is there to sort of highlight and utilize those sort of micro and macro controls in terms of scouting and the frequencies of concentration and cognitive output. I'm sorry, audience. I'm now about to talk about science again. And this is the most scientific part of the whole of the talk. So if you need any explanation, feel free to email me at cameron.vanloo@staff.ac.uk. But I think it's important that I talk about this from a neuroscientific studies point of view as well, given the deeper look in terms of the overview of the brain and its impact in relation to cognitive overload within the frontal cortex of the brain.
And I will remain silent until Cameron has to.
So when we looked at this in terms of some studies and some research, we start looking at the cognitive frontal lobar cortex thanks to stuff like EEG readers, right? Which allows us to understand how the brain operates to things such as shiny lights. And we can look at this in terms of the sort of aspects in relation to the high levels of strain that the brain goes through. Right, so we looked at this in terms of a range of different players, from amateur players up to tier 1 players, and we looked at how the brain sort of interprets that. And one of the interesting things that we realized was when we looked at this sort of narrow sample, and it was a very narrow sample, and I'm not the researcher who conducted this sample, someone else did. This was done at the University of Ottawa, I think it was, if I remember rightly. They realized that as it went through and we looked at the cognitive overload, we realized that players moved away from their frontal lobar cortex needs to what we classify as long-term memory, right? Which means that if you played a game for a long period of time, it becomes muscle memory, right? And that term is, everyone knows what muscle memory is. It's the things that you know how to tie your shoelaces together and type on the keyboard, etc. Or in my case, remembering to, type my email correctly backwards and passwords, etc. So you think
your emails by instinct?
Yeah, I think my emails are my instinct. Yeah.
Think about mine.
Well, I remember it all by instinct. But we think about this in terms of, we look at it from a triangle all approach in terms of cognitive resource. And one of the things that we realized when we looked at tier 1 players and tier 2 players, etc., was their abilities within game were only better because they were able to use their long-term memory to their advantage, right? So if I was to go into a game situation today, I will have some level of cognitive ability, realistically, which will become muscle memory. If I decided that we were going to go into a game of League of Legends, me versus you, in a 1v1 situation, this is nothing against you, Jamie, in terms of that, but you probably played maybe 2% of the amount of time I played League of Legends.
That's generous.
At a push. So realistically, there is a chance that you would beat me because I am bad, like we've talked about. But I'm probably going to rely quite heavily on my muscle memory and my ability in relation to my long-term thinking about the game. Mm-hmm. And as you can look at this in comparison to players who have just started the game, they are getting overloaded by that information, right? So they are having to put their frontal lobar cortex into overload to be able to process that information. And this is why games as a service could be seen as quite temperamental, especially when players are trying to get into a game that something is being established for a long period of time, right? Because as we go through in terms of this and the games, especially the live service games, if you do not join a game early on, you are going to have to deal with realistically, a UI bit is not suitable for you. You're going to have to deal with VFX, which are not suitable for you because it's constantly developing, right? So they end up becoming much more detailed. So usually, and I would like the audience at home who's watching this to look up what Fortnite looked like in season 1 or even in the beta in comparison to what Fortnite looks like in season 7. And you will see there's a lot more complex information within the game. I want you also to think about Overwatch 1 on the day of release versus what Overwatch 2 looks like in season 23, which is, I think, the latest season. And I want you to look at what League of Legends looked like in season 1 and what League of Legends looks like in season 15, which is the current season. So these games have all changed and they've all shifted in that because they want players to maintain and go for it. But if you're a new player entering any of these ecosystems, it becomes incredibly hard for you to understand that. And it also means that you end up having a new level of stress response. So whenever you try to introduce a new player to a live service game and they don't have the opportunity to play against people of their own skill level or build up that knowledge or that viewpoint on it, it becomes very, very difficult. And expert players can utilize and evaluate this and make those experiences very negative for those players. So from a games perspective and a psychology perspective, one of the things I actively encourage all the games developers and designers out there to do is to try to find a way that new players can actually develop their skills against players with a similar ilk. And I know that's something that games developers have been trying to do forever, and I know that it's not always the case because, game populations can be relatively small. You do have those situations. I play many games that are live service games that only have maybe 500-600 players playing at any one time. And I do love to pub stomp someone who comes into a new game, but it's probably not great for those players and those experiences, right? So when we think about this from a neurosociological point of view or response to a task development, we can see that the human process bandwidth within long-term players or players who've stayed within a game is much larger than what we can see in terms of players who just go into it. And that's usually what causes the main difference.
Right. If I could add to that from a sort of games developer's perspective, one of the things that we make sure, one of the things we teach here especially, one of the things we make sure to keep at the forefront of our minds is that we're not developing games for the perfect player. A lot of the times we'll use a concept referred to as allowance to give players more of a chance here, and that's used in a lot of different applications, but give players the best possible chance to read the correct information they need and then apply it. There's also things like, so you've talked about tier lists as well, like tiered ranking lists as well. When you enter into Valorant or CSGO and you're playing the ranked matches, you are ideally playing against people of a sort of similar level to you. So
ideally, yeah.
Level of, obviously smurfing is a thing, but whether there's a similar level of cognitive training, should we call it?
Cognitive training is probably a good term for this one, actually. Yeah, we'll use cognitive training for the remainder of this. Definition of cognitive training is what your brain can see and what it can process in a training or methodical way. So perhaps.
And the last thing I'd add is that we are acutely aware of the disparity between high-level players who have been playing the game for a very long time and new players. And part of game design is making sure that there is entry space for new players coming in and giving them room to experiment and explore and figure things out. And we also make sure that we often make sure that we're thinking about every player. So for example, you mentioned Overwatch 2. Mm-hmm. In the Overwatch titles, there were changes made to visual effects as the game was going forward, some of which were made with the understanding of people with cognitive not cognitive impairments, we've said cognitive too much, visual impairments in mind, so that they were able to easily read effects easier. Mm-hmm. I can't speak to the specifics because it was a while ago, but
2016, so I won't expect you to remember everything.
This was back in 2021.
2021, okay.
Changes made actively.
Actively within the game itself. Okay, interesting.
So it's not something we just, shots like I, as a games developer, just leave to the wayside. And I imagine a lot of the folks working on these games don't as well, because there are things that they've put into League to help players like me who don't have that sort of training to make sure that we're doing the right things, like pre-made builds for characters, so you know what's going to work well for a character, or League has a system where it like collates common builds together. So people often do this. So there's a way of bridging the gap between the known information of the experienced players and new players coming in who are wishing to learn.
Yeah, but that's a really good point in terms of, and we've definitely seen a lot more of this over the recent years, and it's a double-edged sword, but it's not really a double-edged sword. As I spend so much time dealing with players who are what we classify very experienced players, for the most part, we'll use that as the term for today. They go, oh, you've made it too easy for them to learn the game. I remember when I first started playing League of Legends, I was a support player, and all I could buy was one item a game, and it would take 55 minutes for me to buy this item, and all I could buy apart from that was wards. And I was like, yes, the game has become more simple, because believe it or not, you're now in your late 30s, and maybe you don't have that much time to play in the game, and maybe the people around you don't have that much time to play the game. And you also want to get more people playing the game. You want to make it easier, that the gap doesn't become so large that it becomes realistically impossible to bring anyone new into the game. I know that I've spoken to a few different people at different places, right, in particular with their game, because it's one of the longest service games, them and Valve in relation to Dota, where they are actively trying to make the games more simple, and not in relation to take away that skill expression, etc., but so that players feel that they shouldn't be scared about joining the game. And right, I think the thing that we all agree on in terms of development as a whole, not just in relation to me and Jamie here, but as a whole, that we want players to never be scared of playing the game, right? Yeah, and I think that's the thing that games as a service in relation to cognitive overload. I think when we get to the point where it's too much overload or too much information, that's when we start causing players to get scared, and players don't want to play a game. And I've got students on the Esports course in relation to this who will go, I will never play League of Legends because I feel like there is so much to learn, there is so much to go through, and I think that it's going to be miserable, and those experiences are long, those games are long, and that's where this sort of paper came from, this idea came from.
And that verges into another sort of games development topic. Shall I?
Yeah, go for it. This is a random discussion.
Do you want to go through the rest of the lobes in the brain? What does the amygdala do?
It produces endorphins in the brain, and it allows you to feel happy.
I think the amygdala is, it could be, I don't know. I'm not a brain scientist.
I'm pretty sure it is anyway, but we could be going for it.
That might be the fear one, but we'll worry about that later.
It could also improve I don't know.
Some of the things that we're touching on are concepts of metagaming.
Yep.
And metagaming is where people go in and try and find the best possible outcome for any one particular build. So Malzahar in League of Legends probably has somewhere out there, somebody has written the best possible damage outcome for Malzahar.
Yeah.
And it's these items and it's this approach, and you go down here and you do this and you do this. And that's their concept of the best possible approach via like statistics. It happens in everything. If you go on playing D&D, there's folks on the internet who have broken down every single class and subclass and spell into whether it's good or not. And what that means is you end up with a lot of these game concepts where you have to be playing this character right. You have to be playing this character perfectly.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of what prevents me from playing a lot of games. Because I, as a creator, and it's someone who does a lot of experimentation within things like shader languages and that kind of thing, often take a bit more of a sideways approach to how these things are used. So what if you could play Malzahar as a tank character with the right collection of items? What if you could adapt things? But the sort of communities around those games, because of the competitive nature of them, this isn't fashion or anything like this. This is a natural sort of approach to how competitiveness works. Will go for and encourage those in either nice terms or not nice terms, kind of meta builds, because that's the most assured way of getting to a win.
Yeah. So as someone who looks at the sides, I'm trying to work out as the brain. That could be wrong in relation to the brain from both sides of it. I only really look at the frontal lobe cortex. So if you only have that part of your brain, I know all about your brain. If you have every other part,
you have a frontal lobe cortex.
You're having a wonderful time if you have only a frontal lobe cortex. You've got a great memory, but not a lot else. You won't be able to move that much. Anyway, what I wanted us to sort of look at, and I think you're right in terms of this, is, and we can talk about this quite heavily, and I think between me and you, we're probably two of the best people to really talk about this in terms of optimal builds and optimal paths, right? And we're talking about, I talk about this quite often because speedrunners come into this, right? This optimal path to get to a finalized point. And speedrunner is a great example of optimization within practice because it's such a direct outcome, right? You have to finish something and you got to get from point A to point B in the quickest way possible.
Okay.
So there is no sort of difference in relation to it. All the speedrunners are realistically doing are trying to find the optimal path.
True.
Right? So we're going to look through it and take all that information.
If I could ask you, in terms of optimization, because we're looking at about maybe 5 minutes left on this. Can I ask, from your research, you said at the start that the idea of your research and the idea of you as a professional is to inform developers of considerations they should make during development. What would be, for me, as a mechanics developer and a visual effects developer, what would be the main takeaway you would want me to take away from your research and your study approach?
I think there's two things that I want developers to realistically look at. There should always be a simpler version of your game. So if you are a live service game, there should be a simpler version. And we've seen this in terms of League of Legends, we've seen this in terms of Overwatch, etc. A simple version of your game which can be scaffolded. So as a developer, you are going to always have what is classified as the optimal version of your game, right? This could be in relation. And players usually think of this in terms of ranked modes or tournament-based modes, depending on how the developer goes about it. But there should be simple versions of your game. And I think most developers have now got to that stage as live service games. And I think that's something that most people have worked out in terms of that. And that includes more bright lights in terms of the effect. And I love bright lights in relation to it. Bright lights are very good. And I think that's the first thing. The other thing that you need to be sort of acutely aware of, and this is the thing that we've sort of run out of time on, but is that optimization. And there are always going to be players who are going to find the most optimized approach, right? And we sort of highlighted that quite heavily. And I think those players do have a place in games. And by doing that, we can have a better overall understanding of both the cognitive aspects and the viewpoint in relation to the players, but also in relation to the sort of science behind it, that those players are going to have that cognitive output. So Jamie, I'm going to ask you the same question from a games development perspective. What would you like from a scientific perspective that we could then look at to make this a little bit more clear cut for you guys?
So actually, I think you've made it pretty clear cut, because what game developers work really well with, and I'll say this as my conclusion of what I've learned today, work really well with is I like having all the information. You've really sort of rounded out exactly what the problem is, and then you've contextualized it. And where that brain takes me as a designer and a developer is this idea of varying the sort of game space and the game variables to change what that optimization optimal would be. Games like League of Legends do this already. So in a standard 3-lane game of League of Legends, you have one version of optimization. But let's say you're in the mode where there's only one lane. That is a change in the overall variables, which means previous iterations of that perfect optimized point would have changed. And this is how we can vary that up. There's randomized modes inside of League that change the approach and change how you're supposed to play the game. So by varying those things up, you create more optimized areas, but it allows for that wiggle room for new players to experiment and explore. So that's the design approach I take from the research you just given me.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to Mo for having me, and you as well. And you'll be able to catch some of the other episodes from season 2, and have a wonderful day.